You are tuned to IRI Learning, and I am your host, Teacher Teacher. The focus for this States of Matter lesson is the evidence of diffusion in liquids. Check the description box for links to the videos for this unit. By the end of this lesson, we should be able to observe the process of diffusion through a liquid, explain the process of diffusion in liquids, write an observation and a discussion for the diffusion experiment. Hey, it's experiment time, and the aim of this experiment is to observe diffusion through a liquid. Materials needed for this activity include a transparent glass container, such as a drinking glass, a cup of water, dye, such as food coloring, and a 1 millimeter syringe. So let's take a look at the experimental procedure. After setting up the experiment, it's time to make observations. Here are a few questions to guide you along. It's important to mention what is the color of the dye used, describe the overall movement of the dye through the water, and how long did it take for the dye to become uniformly distributed throughout the water. And do not hesitate to record any other thing you have observed, even if it was not suggested in one of the questions given. So here we go, observation time. Here is a sample observation report. The dye used in the experiment had a green color. After 32 minutes, the dye had partially spread around the perimeter of the water at the base of the container. Within 60 minutes, the dye had spread entirely across the water at the bottom of the container and began moving upwards in random patterns. At 105 minutes, the dye was visible in most areas within the volume of water but unevenly distributed. The green color randomly spread throughout the water. Eventually, at about 200 minutes, the green color was evenly distributed throughout the volume of water. Keep in mind, you are not to reproduce this document for class assignments. Now, after the observation follows the analysis and interpretation, which we sometimes call the discussion. So we're going to now explain what happened during our experiment. And if we take a look at the key at the top left of our screen, you'll notice that the blue dots represent water and the green dots represent the dye molecules. You may have already noticed that there are two things going on here. We have a region that has a lot of water molecules, and then we have another area with only dye molecules, or mainly dye molecules. As a result, this means that there are two different concentration gradients that are being set up in this experiment. However, I'm going to take it one step at a time, and I'm going to focus on the dye molecules first. And then, after understanding the dye molecules, I will talk a little about what happens with the water molecules. So let's focus on the dye molecules. So if we notice that there's a region of concentrated dye molecules where we actually applied the dye or placed the dye in the water sample. So therefore, that is the region of high dye molecule concentration. It's the source where the dye was added to the water in the experiment. Then And secondly, we would have an area of low dye molecule concentration, which occurs within the surrounding water because there are no dye molecules present. So as a result, a concentration gradient is established for the dye molecules because there's a region where there is a lot of dye molecules and an area where there are no dye molecules. So as a result, the concentration gradient set up for the dye molecules will result in the movement of the dye molecules from the region of high dye molecule concentration to the region of low dye molecule concentration. And so we can simply say that the dye molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration until evenly distributed. And of course, we know this process is called diffusion. However, you would also notice that water molecules also moved because there was a region of high water molecule concentration as well as an area of lower water molecule concentration. So a concentration gradient was also set up for the water. And as a result, we saw the movement of some water molecules into the space where the dye was because the water molecule concentration was lower at that point or region in the experiment. Here are some discussion questions to guide us when writing the analysis and interpretation for our lab report. 1. Why was a dye used in this experiment? 2. Why was the mixture left to stand and not stirred after adding the dye? 3. Where were the regions of high and low dye concentration in the experimental setup? 4. Explain the movement of the dye particles through the undisturbed water. Here is a sample discussion. This experiment demonstrated the movement of the green dye molecules through an undisturbed liquid, which was water. The use of the green dye provided visible evidence that the particles were moving and proved that the particles of matter are always in constant motion, even when not agitated by an external force. For this experiment, the region of high dye or solute concentration was at the application point, and the surrounding water was a region of low dye concentration. The difference in the solute concentration between these two areas established the concentration gradient for the dye. The dye molecules passively moved from the area of high to low solute concentration. The moving dye molecules collided with moving water molecules, which resulted in the haphazard pattern in which the green dye moved and circulated through the water. The movement of the green dye molecules from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration until evenly distributed in the water demonstrated diffusion. Remember not to reproduce this sample document for any class assignment. Here are the lesson summary points. A concentration gradient develops when there's a difference in the concentration of any given substance between two adjacent areas. Diffusion does not require a semipermeable membrane. Diffusion involves the movement of fluid particles, liquid or gas, from a region of high to low concentration. We have reached the end of our lesson. If you found this video helpful, remember to like, share, and subscribe. When you subscribe, you will receive notifications as new videos are uploaded. So until next time, I am Teacher with IRE Learning.